Hi, everyone. Welcome to the ACEDS presentation of Wait, Aren't They the Same Things? TAR versus Cal Duel. I would like to take this opportunity to briefly introduce our speakers. Our first speaker is Lilith Batlea, who is the Vice President of Data Services at DPrism Advisors. She has extensive experience in the strategic application of data science, AI machine learning, and analytics. She also has experience in research and development of machine learning software. Ms. Batlea is a graduate from Northwestern University, magna cum laude, and she is a regular speaker on topics such as ESI protocols, statistical sampling, data science, and technology-assisted review. Our second speaker is Dr. Jeremy Pickens, who is currently a chief scientist at Conga. He is known as an information retrieval research scientist and a pioneer in the field of collaborative exploratory algorithm search. In his previous positions, he spearheaded the development of Insight Predict, which is the first commercially available TAR 2.0 tool. Dr. Pickens earned his doctoral degree at the University of Massachusetts. He continuously organizes research workshops and speaks at various scientific conferences around the world and has several patents in the field of information retrieval. We encourage that you ask questions as we go, and I will monitor and do my best to present them to the speakers. We will also have a Q&A period at the end, time permitting. Off to you guys.
Go ahead, Lilith.
Oh, thank you, Jada. Yeah, let's start with the first slide. All right, so you're already getting a sense of my sense of humor, but in all seriousness, an algorithm is a computational procedure. But I know that the way that the word gets used sometimes in our industry and e-discovery, it can be a little bit of a mystery what exactly we mean when we talk about an algorithm. So the first part of this presentation will be a little bit of a computer science 101. Yeah, let's go ahead and dive in, and we'll start with an example of a very simple algorithm. So if we were to try to find the largest number on this list, as people, we might just scan it, look for the ones that start with 9s and go from there. But if we wanted to have a really systematic way of going through any list of numbers, the instructions in English might look something like this. Right, we're going to treat 0 as the answer until we find a higher number. And we're going to compare each number with the default answer, which is whichever is the highest number we've come across so far. We'll go through one by one. If it's higher, we'll update that to the final answer, right? And what we're left with will be the highest number on the list. Again, these are those instructions in plain English. And slide. This is what that looks like written in Python, assuming that you have a list of numbers as a variable somewhere. So that is what an algorithm is, just a very, very simple example of one type of algorithm. Slide, please. So if that's all an algorithm is, what is so special about a machine learning algorithm? Why is this changing the world that we live in? How is it different from other algorithms? So the key difference, and slide, the key difference with machine learning is that the algorithm builds a statistical model, generally a statistical model. There are other sorts of models, and we'll get into that. And it's the model that predicts the output. So given the set of inputs and outputs that the machine is trained on, you're left with the output. And that's a pretty major distinction. So you used to, oh yeah, we can keep going. So you used to need to know exactly, okay, if the logic of, if this, then that. And what's revolutionary about machine learning algorithms is that you can build a model that predicts the output rather than needing to know exactly step by step. So slide. So just to really highlight what a model is, we can actually think of search terms as a very, very simple model, right? So let's say you're working on a project, and Project Alpha was the name of whatever is central to the dispute. You might use that as a search term, and then you're basically modeling a very, very simply. Okay, if the document has the word Project Alpha, then it is responsive. And if it doesn't, then it's not responsive. And of course, there's the additional review because you're accounting for the fact that you're going to have false positives. But at the most fundamental level, this, as you can think of a search term as a very, very simple model. If it has it, then it is responsive. If it doesn't, then it's not responsive. And this type of model might actually work for certain search terms or certain things. You might need something as simple as this, but that's very, very rare, as we all know, because most of the time, only a very small fraction of the search term hits actually are responsive. And most people don't even take into account how many documents might be missed because the search term wasn't present in it. So machine learning gives you a much more nuanced model, and you can skip search terms entirely and start to have a much more sophisticated way of predicting whether certain documents are responsive or not. Now, of course, there's all the considerations around proportionality and cost, but if those didn't have to be considered at all, then ideally we would be able to run TAR or CAL or any approach with machine learning across an entire corpus without layering models on top of each other with search terms and all of that. Slide. So I'll turn it over to Jeremy to get into all the different types of algorithms that go into TAR and CAL.
Oh, thank you, Lilith. So here's a nice image that Ralph Losey and Doug Ord created almost 10 years ago at this point. And what this image is it's a breakdown of all the different kinds of algorithms and how they fit together in an entire technology-assisted review stack, a TAR stack. So by going through these different layers, you're going to understand a little bit better what the difference is between TAR versus CAL, and where the kinds of algorithms that Lilith was just talking about, the predictive algorithms, predicting the responsiveness of a document, where that fits into this whole stack as well. So here is the slide in a nutshell. So feature construction is just the notion of starting with your raw data, whether it's your emails, your Excel documents, your images, anything you collect as part of discovery, and pulling out little chunks of information from those documents. Those could be words if it's a text document. Those could be pixels and pixel colors if it's an image. Could be little segments of audio if it's a voice recording, voicemail, and so that's the bottom layer, the feature construction. The feature transformation layer takes those raw features and makes them smarter, combines them in different ways. And the simplest way, for text, for words, you could imagine putting together individual words into longer phrases. So states by itself, or let's say York by itself versus New York as a phrase. That's known as the algorithms that process textual raw features into something more complicated are known as NLP, natural language processing algorithms. By themselves, natural language processing algorithms don't actually predict the responsiveness of a document. What they do is they combine lower level features into sort of a more semantically meaningful representation that gets used by the classifier layer of the TAR stack. And that classifier layer is what Lilith was talking about, where you have a model that predicts the responsiveness of a document. And that works, again, by taking in coding values of documents that you've previously coded and learning which of your raw features and your transformed features are indicative of positive documents and which ones are indicative of negative documents, and creating a large statistical representation of that entire set. Finally, at the top layer is where you get process algorithms. And process algorithms are ways in which you interactively use build and rebuild the classifiers, the predictive models at layer 3. So if you take all of this together, and CAL, continuous active learning, is one of the most well-known process algorithms here in the industry. There's SAL as well, also known as TAR 1.0. CAL is also known as TAR 2.0, and other approaches that people take as well. That there's a lot of manual approaches that people use at the method layer. So if you take all of these together, if you take the process, the classifiers, the features, the transformed features, and then you add in, whatever searching, human searching, clustering, analytics you want to do, all that together is known as TAR. According to the original TAR definition, which was from Maura Grossman and Gordon Cormack about 10 years ago, a TAR without a classifier layer, without that AI layer 3 there, is not, it may be a fine way of going through documents, but it's not technically TAR. Technology assisted review has to have some form of supervised machine learning to make it TAR. But this sort of shows in a nutshell that CAL is different from TAR, because CAL is just one process inside of a larger stack of algorithms that together make up the entire TAR process. So let's break this down a little bit further and put some words, put in context some words you might have heard throughout the years. Let's start at the lowest layer, the feature construction and feature transformation layers. As I was saying earlier, you could have raw features such as the individual words in a text document, email addresses, you might pull out document dates, but from those as raw features, from those words, you can transform those words into longer phrases. York and new becomes New York. You could pull out entities. You could label things as people, as places, as things. You can do sentiment analysis on top of your words and figure out which documents or which regions of text express different sentiments. You probably have heard of latent semantic indexing or probabilistic latent semantic indexing. Those are ways of collapsing words down into a lower dimensionality that puts together, say, the word truck with the word lorry. And so anytime you see truck, it also will match the word lorry and vice versa, because they are semantically related to each other. And of course, word2vec, fast text, BERT, these are more modern ways of doing the same thing. But again, none of these by themselves predict the responsiveness of a document. These are just ways of transforming lower layer raw features into a higher level representation. Now, whether these higher level representations are always better, that's an empirical question that if we had more time, we'll see how we are at the end of this discussion that I would love to get into. They may not always be better, but this is at least what they are and how they fit into the whole stack. So let's look now into the classifier layer and tie that together. Suppose you've got, you've probably heard of different predictive algorithms such as support vector machines, logistic regression, k-nearest neighbor, neural networks. These are the sorts of algorithms that actually, if you feed them with labeled documents, that do build models of and do predictions of whether or not other documents are going to be responsive or non-responsive. And what they make use of is lower layer, these lower layer features. So a logistic regression algorithm could make use of a BERT dense vector or an LSI representation, or the sentiment of the document, or the raw words in the document, or the phrases. Can sort of combine all of these together into a prediction, as can support vector machines or k-nearest neighbor and so on. There is a form of deep learning that combines all of these, the feature extraction, the feature transformation, and the prediction into a single stack. And I know for a number of years in this industry, people were making claims about doing deep learning and having deep learning. I've never actually seen a full end-to-end deep learning stack among any vendors, right? And I don't work for a vendor currently in the e-discovery space, so there's no, I'm not pro or con anything. I'm just saying that, I haven't seen that despite claims to the opposite. But that's deep learning should tie across all of those stacks together. So here's an example of a very simple algorithm known as a supervised machine learning algorithm known as a decision tree. Let's suppose you have a number of doc IDs, 1 through 7. You can see in the second column here, you have a number of features you've extracted from those doc IDs. The features are the words manatee, the words motorboat, and the words county. The yes or no indicates whether or not that word is present in that document. And then you have a list of coding calls over on the left as to whether or not that document is responsive or non-responsive. A supervised machine learning algorithm will take a set of data like this using the responsiveness coding calls and using the presence or absence of words or other features in the document and build this decision tree representation. So this is again, a very simple representation that says first looks at whether the word manatee is in the document, and if it is, it asks whether the word county is in the document, and if it's not, then the document is responsive, because apparently there's a county in Florida known as Manatee County, and if you're looking for manatees, the animal, and it's talking about Manatee County, that's probably not going to be responsive. So if county is present, there's a -1, non-responsive, and that's the model. And you can run through any document and look at whether or not different words are present, and just by following down that decision tree, it will give you the prediction of 1 or -1 as to whether the document is responsive. So again, as Lilith said, there are more complicated models than this, but at some level, it is relatively simple. So finally, let's look at the top layer, the process layer, number 4, against the classification layer, number 3. So you can see down at the bottom here, see the yellow bit where I have the support vector machine, logistic regression, k-nearest neighbor, et cetera. It's kind of cut off, but you can see that those are different supervised machine learning algorithms that one could use in a TAR platform. The process layer is all about different ways of picking the documents that get used to train those supervised machine learning algorithms. And there's 2 broad categories or 2 broad dimensions around which documents can be picked. Whether or not the selection itself is active versus passive, and whether or not the selection is finite or infinite. So active versus passive. So active means that there's another machine algorithm that uses certain decision criteria to select documents that are going to be the most informative or most useful to put in front of reviewers at that point in time. So that's an active learning algorithm. A passive learning algorithm is one that's either done by random sampling. So there's no machine intelligence. It's just, you roll the dice and pick the next document that, that lands on a 6. And search, using keyword search to find more documents for training, is also another form of passive learning, because it doesn't involve an active machine process. The finite versus infinite dimension up there at the top is whether or not you are going to limit training for a certain number of documents, stop training, and then just use the model as it is, or whether or not you're going to continue training the algorithm until such point as you've met your objective, typically finding all the responsive documents. So TAR 2.0, which in various vendor lingos has been known as CAL, continuous learning, active learning, continuous multimodal learning. So everyone puts their little spin and tries to make it sound different, but it's all of these use some form of infinite training. In other words, you never stop training, and there's a mixture of active machine picking, and it could be mixed in with some passive learning if you wanted to as well. You can always do searches and enhance the algorithm that way as well. The TAR 1.0 approaches, the finite ones over on the left, those are broken down into simple passive learning and simple active learning, SPL and SAL. Simple passive learning is a finite amount of training where you only do random sampling to select these training documents. And simple active learning is where you do finite training and you only use the uncertainty algorithm to select documents for training. That was a mouthful. I hope everyone understood all that. If there are questions, we can talk later, or please feel free to jump in. But that's a breakdown, really, of the entire stack of TAR and what all the different algorithms are and what they're doing and why. So how do you know that one TAR approach is better than another TAR approach? Like, that's great. Okay, there's all this mixture of lingo and algorithms, and how can I tell that something's better than something else? Well, I'll tell you how Lilith and I think as scientists. We do controlled studies, right? We look at you remember this from 8th grade science, right? You take some phenomenon and you change one aspect of that phenomenon, change one variable, and you see what it looks like with that variable, and you see what it looks like without that variable. And then you see what each one produces, and then you compare those results against each other. And it's that same scientific method, it's that sort of thinking that that helps you understand which approaches are better. So in this case right here, let's say I want to compare simple active learning versus TAR as SAL versus TAR as CAL. What I might do is I might use the same set of features on the lower level. I might use the same set, transform those features into phrases. I might use the same logistic regression algorithm. And the only thing I might change is whether or not I'm doing finite uncertainty sampling versus infinite relevance sampling. The more SAL approach versus the CAL approach. So I just change the process and I leave everything else about it the same. And then I know that when it produces a different result, the difference in that result is due to the process algorithm, the CAL versus the SAL, versus due to different phrases or different words or a different, support vector machine versus logistic regression, right? Because if I change two things at the same time, I won't know if my outcomes are different because of the process or because of some other factor. So what about CAL? Let's say somebody says that word vectors, a dense BERT embedding is better than than keywords, keywords and key phrases. That's something that can be tested as well. In that case, you would leave the two process layers the same. You would use continuous active learning in both conditions. You would use logistic regression in both conditions. And then on the one hand, you would have your words and you would transform them into phrases. And on the other hand, you would have your words and transform them into word-to-vec or BERT or some other dense vector representation. And then you can run them through and see how quickly, if you could get to a high recall at a low, at high recall at high precision with one versus the other to see really whether or not it was better. So again, the blue is the places where they differ. The two approaches differ. I've heard claims over the years of people saying that they use multiple AI algorithms, not just one AI algorithm inside of their CAL algorithm, and that gives them a better result. That's something that can be tested as well. So there in the middle layer, someone might swap back and forth during the process between different supervised machine learning algorithms, and but still run the whole thing inside of a CAL process. You can test that, you can see what it produces, and then you can run those same documents with the same words and the same phrases through a single algorithm and see if that multi-algorithm approach is better than the single algorithm approach. Again, I've heard claims over the years about this. I've never seen people come up with actual raw data showing the side-by-side comparison in something like this. So this is one thing I would encourage you as lawyers as well, is to ask these sorts of questions of your vendors. And if they're making claims like this, ask them to prove it to you with a side-by-side comparison like this. So yeah, there are different ways of mixing and matching various processes, algorithms, features, raw features, and so on. And so why don't we say, why don't we just pick the best of breed at each layer, right? Pick the best supervised algorithm with the best feature transformation with the best process. And the problem is that things that are really delicious on their own, here we have some sea urchin sushi over on the left, and over on the right, we have a delicious chocolate fudge sauce. Both of these things are extremely delicious, but having the chocolate sauce on top of the sea urchin sushi probably doesn't work well together. The overall experience combining them is not as good, even though each of these might be best in class by their own. Or radishes, raw radishes straight from the garden are delicious. Blueberry pie is delicious, but radishes on blueberry pie probably doesn't work. So in the same way, when you think about simple active learning and continuous active learning. Simple active learning, so uncertainty sampling that's done in a finite manner, that's SAL. Relevant sampling with an infinite continuous learning, that's CAL. But if we were to do infinite training with only uncertainty sampling, in other words, you always forever just pick the documents that the algorithm is uncertain about, you're only going to be picking the middle of the deck and never getting the stuff at the top. And so it's going to take much longer to get to a high recall point. And so it doesn't really work to mix, even though uncertainty sampling is good, even though infinite learning is good, it doesn't really work to mix those together. Same with finite sampling done in a relevant sampling manner. If you only pick the top of the list, but then stopped after a certain point, that's not going to be as effective either. And again, if I had more time, I can spend an hour just on this slide alone. But I will move on. So one important thing, and Lilith is going to talk a little bit more about this in a bit, but one really important thing to keep in mind is that when you are selecting TAR algorithms and you're piecing all these things together, or asking your vendor to piece all these things together for you, you really have to keep in mind what your goal is, what the target is that you're trying to hit. Because without a target, it doesn't make sense to say that something's better than something else. And I'll give you a case in point. Which of these two vehicles will get you to your destination fastest? Right? Well, I mean, isn't that Air Canada jet a little bit faster than the VW bus? It is. You know, it does move pretty quickly. But if your goal is to get to the local supermarket, then that jet, even though it travels faster, it's probably not going to be the best approach. You're probably going to want to use that old beat up VW bus that's going to get you there faster. Because by the time you get to the airport by the time they build the landing strip next to the grocery store, you know, you got probably about 10 years until that happens. And yeah, it's just going to take forever to get you there. So on the other hand, if your goal is to get to Prague, then that VW bus is probably not going to make that ocean crossing, and the jet is going to be more effective. Even if you had to walk from the airport to your hotel from Prague, you would still get there faster than you would if you were driving that VW bus from Toronto. So the lesson for RFP, and I see this all the time in RFPs, is they tend to just sort of throw out the buzzwords of the day. Do you have this? Do you have that? And you make selections of your TAR platform based on which you know, does it have all the checklist of things that it's supposed to have? Well, that's not necessarily useful, because more is not more, and it's really all about how it fits together, and not whether or not, you know, it is a jet airplane or an eel sushi or a radish, right?
Thank you so much, Jeremy. So yeah, so now let's spend some time deep diving on which of all of these options is going to help in achieving whatever your goal for that project is. And let's slide, please. Let's look at some common goals with e-discovery, right? So first and foremost, we're trying to identify the documents that belong to a certain category. Often responsiveness, right? We're trying to minimize cost as much as possible. We usually have a deadline, and then we also want to minimize risk, especially risk like producing a privileged document, things like that. Usually you're going to have to choose one as the most important goal, and then you're doing everything you can to kind of achieve all the others, but you'll have to prioritize. Surprisingly, you would think, and actually we'll get into this in just a minute, you would think that identifying the documents belonging to a certain category is the most important goal, but often it's actually the deadline or cost in terms of how things play out. And that's just a trade-off. But if you don't want to make that trade-off, you don't have to. So let's look at some scenarios and hypotheticals. One heuristic, one thing I've seen people do a lot in the space is they'll use a simple active learning approach. So they'll train a model to predict things across their entire population of documents. And then whatever cutoff they're using, they still have someone review every document above that cutoff. One heuristic is that approach doesn't make a lot of sense. If you're going to be looking at every single document that goes out the door, if you're going to be reviewing everything predicted responsive, you might as well use continuous active learning the whole way, because most models improve significantly as you add label data. It's one of the best things that you can possibly do when you're modeling anything across industries is add data. So if you're getting that additional label data, you probably want to be including it in every iteration of the model. That's the only really simple, easy heuristic, and we'll talk about why the converse isn't always true in just a moment. But slide. Oh, and sorry, this is just to illustrate that last point. So, right, if you're spending all the money training the model, and then you also have the additional documents to review, and you're not improving your model over time, you're going to end up spending more money or more of your client's money than if you just used continuous active learning the whole way through. Slide. So let's talk more about predicting the future, right? Because that's basically what we're doing. We're predicting whether a document is responsive or not responsive, or whatever other binary categories. As humans, we tend to rely on intuition, inference, and math to predict the future, right? Everything from revenue forecasting to even when you're using search terms, there's a lot of intuition that goes into that. So what I'd like everyone to do going forward is substitute that intuition with articulated assumptions. So we call it intuition, but if you really dig into it, usually there are all sorts of assumptions that we're making in order to simplify things and predict the future. And if you take one thing away from this entire presentation, it's to articulate your assumptions. And we'll look at a few hypotheticals where the assumptions are really key. Slide. So let's imagine a project, and it's going to be the opposite of that heuristic where we talked about needing to review every document that goes out the door. Let's say that somehow you don't have to worry about the risk of privileged documents at all for some miraculous reason. So your primary goal is to minimize cost as much as possible, and you want to, of course, identify all of the responsive documents. And again, just for the sake of this scenario, we have plenty of time. The deadline is not really a factor or a consideration, but the goal is to produce at least 80% of the responsive documents as cost effectively as possible in this hypothetical. So you might think, well, if we don't need eyes on every document, we might as well use a simple active learning or a TAR 1.0 approach, right? And the assumption here is that the cost of review for each document is equivalent, and that might not be the case. So if you're using a simple active learning or TAR 1 approach, then people tend to think that you need a subject matter expert for that, or right, one of the lead attorneys doing the review for the initial training of the model. That can end up being much more expensive. But if the assumption is correct that the cost of review for each document is equivalent, then this might be the better option. The other assumption that you're making is that continuous active learning always requires you to review more documents than a simple active learning approach. And that's not always true either. So we won't dig into it too much, but just consider a scenario where only 5% of all the documents in your entire population were responsive. Even if you didn't actually need to have eyes on each one before they go out the door, you might be able to, it might be much more cost effective to use continuous active learning than simple active learning in that scenario. But if these assumptions are correct, that the cost of each document is equivalent, and that let's just say that the prevalence of responsive documents is pretty high, then these assumptions might lead you to the best option being simple active learning. And again, as long as the assumptions hold, then your conclusion holds as well. But let's look at a different scenario, or different assumptions with the same scenario. So you might decide that, okay, in order to defend the use of a simple active learning approach or TAR 1.0 approach, we need a subject matter expert to code all the documents. Then it might end up, even if you do have to review more documents to use continuous active learning, you might still save on the cost of everything, because you can have the documents reviewed at a much lower rate per document. And of course, what you have here too is the assumption that a subject matter expert will actually code the documents more accurately than a team of attorney reviewers. That's not always the case either, but people tend to rely on that assumption a lot when they're making decisions about TAR.
And
so you can see, oh, sorry,
I've
go ahead.
done tests around that second assumption, Lilith, and yes, let me just confirm it doesn't always hold. So, but sorry to interrupt.
No, please do chime in at any point. And if anyone has questions, please put them in the chat, and we'll do our best to address them as we keep going. But the main point here is that the assumptions that you're making will lead you to very different conclusions, and it can be really important to just articulate what those assumptions are and evaluate, right? So again, with this set of assumptions, even though you would actually review less, you would end up spending more on that review if you used a simple active learning or TAR 1 approach. So continuous active learning would be the better choice in this hypothetical, given those assumptions. And again, if the assumptions are correct, then the conclusion is correct. So now let's talk more about statistics and validation. So again, assumptions, inference, and math, we can't get away from that inference, and that there is always a chance, however small, but it's the best we have, and we can do some pretty miraculous things with that. Okay, yeah, so like layers of an onion, you can also evaluate each of your assumptions, right? So if you're going into a project thinking, oh, let's use simple active learning or TAR 1.0, and you expect 50% of your documents to be responsive, so that approach is going to intuitively make sense. You can actually test that assumption, right? You can take a random sample and see, well, what is the prevalence of responsive documents? And that might completely change your approach. So let's look at some of these metrics. Slide. So, and I'm throwing some of these words around. I'm imagining that many of you are very familiar already with the basics of TAR, but we'll go over a few metrics and terms like precision, recall, illusion as well. But richness or prevalence is just the percentage of whatever documents you care about out of the entire population. Slide. Okay, and then another thing I just wanted to mention, going back to assumptions. So this is just to illustrate what a huge difference there might be at 95% confidence versus 99% confidence when you're using a really small sample. So the point of this slide, the main takeaway is that sample size matters, right? So the larger the sample, the less of a difference there is in terms of the implications of 95% confidence or 99% confidence, right? You're measuring your uncertainty. And the statistic alone, the point estimate alone, like if you just take 19 out of 100 documents, that 19% point estimate, which we have for all of these, every single one of these, the point estimate here would be 19%. The uncertainty around that varies a lot depending on the sample size. So even if you don't just rely on the 95% confidence, right, you would only need to sample 100 documents for 95% confidence, but at that point it might matter a lot more to have a 99% confidence estimate. So again, the main takeaway here is just make sure that you're using a large enough sample size and that you're interpreting all these metrics, precision, recall, illusion, based on the size of the sample and not just that point estimate. Slide. And yeah, we'll dig into the validation metrics and then the assumptions that you're making when you use different approaches to validation. And I'll let Jeremy talk more about counterfactuals at the end if we have the time. So recall, and I think most people are already familiar with this, but recall is just a percentage of all the documents that you intended to find. What percentage did you actually find? Precision, out of all the documents that you found, what percentage were actually the ones that you wanted to find? And then illusion, out of all the documents that you excluded from review and production, out of all the documents that you considered as not what you wanted to find, what percentage were actually the ones you wanted to find? All right, so here we go more with the assumptions, but keep in mind that every time you choose an approach to validation, you're also making all sorts of assumptions and deciding whether you want to rely on those assumptions. So the assumptions you're making, if you don't validate at all, and I want to call out that this is basically what happens in almost every project. People use search terms, and as we discussed earlier, search terms are basically a very, very simple, unsophisticated model. So they should, ideally, theoretically, we would validate the same way that we do for tar, we would with search terms, but most people don't. And the assumptions, right, are just that every review document is actually coded accurately and that all the documents excluded from review really are not responsive. So, right, so if you don't, and if you are comfortable with these assumptions, when you're using search terms and you don't validate at all, you should be just as comfortable not validating if you're using tar. I mean, I know people can make the arguments around, oh, well, you know what you would find with the search terms, but that's an untested assumption. So if you're going with your intuition, oh, I just know which documents are going to be responsive and they're going to be the ones that match these search terms, that is an assumption that you can be comfortable with, but it is an assumption. So I just wanted to call that out and emphasize that point. And right, if you're truly comfortable with that and opposing is comfortable with that, then maybe you don't need to validate at all. But I think that's rarely the case. Slide. So another popular approach to validation is just with an illusion test, right? And one thing to keep in mind is that the illusion rate by itself doesn't tell you very much, right? So the illusion rate, without considering the number of responsive documents found, is pretty meaningless. You still would want to estimate recall one way or another. But the other assumptions that you're making, if you're only validating with an illusion test and nothing else, is that every review document is coded accurately and consistently, and especially including the actual sample, right? Anytime that you're making any inference from a sample, you're assuming that every document in the sample was coded accurately and consistently.
Let me jump in, Lilith, and just give a concrete example of that, if I may.
Please.
So I've seen this so many times where the party will do a random sample of the illusion set and say, well, only 1% of the documents in this illusion set were responsive. 1% sounds like a really small number, right? You hardly missed anything. But what if 1%, like before doing all your searching and keywords and tar and everything, what if 1% of the documents in the entire collection were responsive? Then you've done nothing at all. I could literally produce 0 documents and still have a 1% illusion rate. And so it's the difference between what you've done and what you haven't done that's important, not the magnitude of what you haven't done that you should keep in mind. So
right. And even if you do calculate recall based on the illusion rate, keep in mind that you're assuming that every document is coded accurately and consistently. You're not challenging that, and sometimes you might, right? Sometimes a lot of the documents tagged responsive might not actually be responsive, or vice versa. So if you're comfortable with the assumption that they are, then that might be an approach you take to validation. But it's another assumption that could be tested if you wanted to. Slide. So if you are validating with a random sample of all the documents in the population, and this is an approach that you might take in a TAR 1.0 or simple active learning workflow. Again, you're assuming that every document in the sample is coded accurately and consistently, and then that the sample is a random sample of all potentially responsive documents, right? So if you're using this approach on a search term cold set, then again, you're assuming that every single possible responsive document started out in your TAR population, and sometimes the assumption is valid and sometimes it's not. So that's another popular approach to validation in the underlying assumptions. And then I think that's slide. I think that's it for the hypotheticals and scenario, and we should be wrapping up here and giving you a chance to ask some questions. On that last slide, if I can just geek out a little bit, one more thing where you have to be careful of your assumptions is even the distributions of the data that you're using, right? So if you are using an illusion test, it's the normal approximation formula that's used to calculate confidence intervals at 95% or 99% is inappropriate, because when you have really, really low prevalence, then the distribution is no longer approximately normal. It's no longer Gaussian or bell-shaped. It becomes one-tailed, and there are different approaches to calculating confidence intervals that will give you a much more accurate answer. All right, so yeah, slide and it looks like we might have some questions, but the key things to keep in mind here are: did you measure what you think you measured? Does what you measured actually measure the extent to which you met your goal? And then whatever approach you're taking, align the evaluation methodology with the goals. And of course, right, there are all the considerations just around what's defensible based on precedent and all of that. We didn't get into very much of that. And I know that sometimes the reason that people do things is just because that's the precedent or that's what other people have done. But hopefully all of this gives you some ideas of where that might be challenged and how to be more rigorous in your application of technology-assisted review. Oh, I already said this. I think we're good. Jeremy, do you want to wrap things up?
Yeah, let me wrap things up and answer. There's a question from Ralph Losey in the chat. Jada, would you read that out?
Of course. It is astonishing that you still have to spend time justifying cal over cell. We knew not to use cell over 10 years ago in De Silva more. Common sense. Cell only benefits people interested in driving up costs for selfish reasons. How often do you still see cell with doc review? Ever still see just keywords with linear of all hits? That's really wasteful. Great presentation. Keep up the good work. So the question is, how often do you still see cell with all doc review? And if you ever still see just keywords with linear of all hits?
Yeah, so I think it is rare where a simple active learning or a TAR 1.0 approach really does make the most sense, but I don't want to say that it never makes sense, right? So in a second request or something like that, you have some huge population and a really tight deadline. Perhaps that is the right approach in that given those particular circumstances and the goals there. So I wouldn't say that there is never ever a place for simple active learning, but certainly it's important to think critically about whether that's the most appropriate approach or not.
Well, no, and I think when dealing with the DOJ, they actually require a TAR 1.0 simple active learning approach. I think you're not allowed, and then they don't allow review after the, sorry to our Canadian cousins, that there's a more US centric answer, but yeah, they don't allow you to do review post training, and they require you to do finite, simple, TAR 1.0 training. So it does still exist in certain contexts. And frighteningly, I see a lot of keyword searching followed by linear review still. That is way more common even than SAL. So like, even if people would use SAL, even though Cal beats SAL, again, under Lilith's articulated assumptions, even if Cal generally does better, SAL will still beat keyword search with linear review, but keyword search with linear review is unfortunately massively prevalent even to today. So it boggles my mind as to why this is still happening, but it does. So yeah, just we have more questions.
So one of the questions from Leslie Larson is that, do you recommend basic computer science as a discipline for e-discovery experts, regardless of their experience in the field?
So computer science is more the study of data structures and deterministic algorithms rather than machine learning, which are stochastic algorithms. So computer science probably not, but a critical thinking mindset that comes with computer science is something that I would recommend, and it's actually something that I think lawyers, you've already been trained in it. And let me tell a quick story we only have 1 minute left. Quick story if I could. My mother taught me how to be a computer scientist when I was 9 years old. My mother was an English major. And the way she taught me is that she looked at me, and she hates sour food. And I love sour food. And every time I would grab a dill pickle from those big dill pickle vats, and start eating it, she would look at me in all seriousness and say, "Jeremy, don't you know that dill pickles are incredibly dangerous to your health?" "Really, Mom? Why?" And her justification: "Well, everybody that ate a dill pickle during the American Civil War is now dead." Of course, that was 150 years ago. And so are they dead because of the dill pickle, or are they dead because it's been that much time that's elapsed? And if you can just think critically when someone comes to you with a claim, and whether dill pickles are dangerous to your health, whether BERT is the best way to do feature transformation, whether CAL is the best way to do process, ask the person who's making that claim to justify it with a side-by-side and say, well, all the people who didn't eat dill pickles during the Civil War, what is their status? Oh, they're also dead. Okay, maybe it wasn't the dill pickles. So that kind of critical thinking is what I would recommend, not necessarily computer science.
Yeah, and it also depends on exactly what you're doing in the space. So certainly for certain things, I think it is a very good core discipline. Although most of my background in data science is more on the statistics side, right? And the algorithms that build the models are building statistical models. So I came in through that statistics background more than the computer science background.
So we hope this helps you understand the difference between CAL and TAR, and why CAL is not TAR, but CAL is a piece of TAR, and how the rest of the TAR fits together. So thank you very much for coming.
Jeremy and Lilith, do you guys have any recommended further reading, or, if people wanted to do a little bit of their own research? Is there a good book?
All of Maura Grossman's articles. I think she might be here, but I'll call that out. Yeah.
I agree.
Well, thank you very much. Is there any other questions from our audience? I'm not seeing any on there. Oh, John, you have a question? Is that a clap or a hand raise?
Oh, it's applause.
Oh, it's an applause. I thought it was an applause, but a couple of people said hands up. With that, I just want to thank our speakers. This was a fabulous presentation, a really awesome deep dive. And I absolutely enjoy listening to and getting a really different version of what we get in our e-discovery bubble, a different perspective on these items. So thank you very much for doing this presentation for us and being here with us today. And yes, the presentation will be available to rewatch.
Thank you for having us.
Yes,
Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.